On Thursday, former President Jimmy Carter's state funeral was held at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. This is an unusual opportunity where we see lots of former presidents and vice presidents all gathered together and actually sitting within a few feet of one another. And so there were a lot of memes floating around yesterday, lots of video of the presidents and vice presidents interacting. Anything strike you guys from the scenes that we saw Thursday at the funeral?
I mean, I think the most interesting thing in that regard was just the back and forth, seemingly joking relationship between Obama and Trump. These are two people who have said the most devastating things about each other and represent in some ways opposite poles of the American political spectrum. But they seem to be having a very casual and almost friendly relationship. They made each other laugh. And I think that was an image that really struck a lot of people.
Some of those interactions among the former presidents were so fascinating. And, the very idea that former Vice President Mike Pence was sitting behind President-elect Trump after President-elect Trump endangered his life on January 6th.
Yeah, and Vice President Pence did shake Trump's hand, but his wife, Karen Pence, did not stand up and did not shake Trump's hand, which I think was a pretty poignant moment. Welcome to the campaign moment for this Friday, January 10th. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter and author of the Campaign Moment newsletter. Today, I'm joined by Naftali Ben-David, a White House editor at The Post who is soon taking on a new role as our senior national political correspondent. Hey, Naftali.
Hey, thanks for having me.
We're also joined today by national political reporter Maeve Reston. Hey, Maeve.
Hey, how's it going?
So we've got a lot to dig into today, including, as mentioned, former President Jimmy Carter being honored at a state funeral on Thursday. He's also being laid to rest on Friday in Plains, Georgia. And this morning, President-elect Donald Trump was formally sentenced in New York. The case was, of course, about hush money payments that Trump made to an adult film actress who accused him of an affair during the 2016 election. We just heard that Trump will be sentenced to something known as unconditional discharge, which we'll get into in a little bit here. In other news related to Trump's legal investigations, a federal court declined to block the release of special counsel Jack Smith's reports on Trump's election interference and classified documents cases. That leaves the possibility open that we could see those reports in the near future. We're also going to be talking about the political fallout from the horrific wildfires in Los Angeles. There's been a lot of blame and misinformation going around, so we're going to talk about that and some of the actual facts on the ground there. We're also going to look ahead to the high-profile Senate confirmation hearings of Trump's pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and others, which are scheduled to kick off next week. That's a lot. Are you guys ready to get started?
Yes.
Can't wait.
Okay, let's dig in. So we are taping this conversation a little after 10:30 a.m. on Friday. And just a few minutes ago, New York Judge Juan Merchan sentenced Trump to unconditional discharge in the New York hush money case. The judge said that he must, quote, respect and follow the protections of the office of the president, but that those powers do not have the ability to erase a jury verdict. Trump won't serve jail time or receive any probation, which we've known for a few days now. But this is pretty historic because Trump is now the first former president or president-elect in U.S. history to officially be a convicted felon. Naftali, you were watching the sentencing. It feels like this case has been drawn out for so long, and I imagine some people are wondering why it's even noteworthy anymore. How are you thinking about the sentencing that we just saw?
Well, I do think there's a way in which it's symbolic or at least technical in the sense that a jury had already found Donald Trump guilty of 34 felony counts, and we knew that the judge was not really going to impose a sentence that involved jail time or probation or anything like that. That said, I think it's a very important symbol, not only because it, in a sense, concludes the felony proceedings and puts sort of a final stamp on his status as a convicted felon and the first one to occupy the White House, of course, but simply the spectacle today of somebody who is about to become the most powerful person in the world, who has already served as the most powerful person in the world, and having to, I think he did it remotely, but nonetheless, he had to sit there and listen as prosecutors excoriated his behavior. He had to listen as a judge was highly critical of his crimes and what he had done. And that was really a moment that seemed to me sort of distinctive in terms of the American political system.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think a lot of the narrative around this is that the cases against Trump didn't really amount to much. We saw 3 of the other indictments basically go away with Trump's election as president. This case, we saw a conviction, but it's not going to result in really any punishment. That's what an unconditional discharge is. But on the other hand, this is somebody who is about to be taking office as president. This is somebody who tried to halt these proceedings and try and get this case thrown out, try and get the sentencing, not to take place. The Supreme Court on Thursday night declined to go along with that. And so the system at least did register something in this case, right?
Yeah, and the irony is that this was the case that a lot of people thought was the weakest. Many people who are critics of Donald Trump or political adversaries wished Alvin Bragg, the DA in Manhattan, hadn't brought this case because it was supposed to be resting on the flimsiest sort of chain of evidence and the flimsiest legal theory. And in fact, it's the last one standing. The other cases that involve election interference, that involve the alleged mishandling of classified documents, they've all been halted, suspended, dismissed, whatever it is. And this is the one case in which the American justice system was able to register an actual verdict of some kind against Donald Trump.
Yeah, and it feels like, the way that President-elect Trump has responded to all of this is in the same way that he always has. He was portraying himself this morning as a victim, talking about how this was a witch hunt. All of the people who support him are fully behind that narrative. But it does leave a mark and a stain on his legacy. Obviously, not one that was a big enough hurdle for a lot of voters to get past. But I think he's just going to kind of move on from this, feeling as though he didn't face, many consequences in all the other cases. So it's kind of one marker, but not one that I think will ultimately make a huge difference.
Naftali, can you just explain to us real quickly what unconditional discharge is? That's a very kind of bizarre term, but what does it actually boil down to?
Right. And I think it's like so much about this, something that doesn't come up too often. But what it boils down to is reaffirming that this was a case that was appropriately determined. The defendant was found guilty, but for whatever series of circumstances, and in this case, the circumstances that the defendant just got elected president of the United States, there is not going to be an actual penalty imposed, whether it's financial, whether it's prison time, whatever it is. But it's something that from the perspective of the legal system, and maybe the political one as well, is kind of an important finding.
So this wasn't the only news that we got this week regarding the fading legal turmoil that Trump has faced over the last 2 years. There's also been some wrangling over if and when we will get special counsel Jack Smith's report about his 2 investigations into the classified documents case and also the January 6th probe. The former case had been dismissed and the latter is effectively going away now that Trump has been elected president. But special counsels are tasked with writing these reports. We saw it back in the Trump presidency when we got the Mueller report. Naftali, can you catch us up on the legal wrangling here over if and when we will get these reports and what the Justice Department has said about this?
For those who might not remember exactly what those cases were, we're talking about one case that involves President Trump's alleged interference or attempt to overturn the results of the 2020 election, particularly on the events of January 6th, 2021. And we're also talking about his alleged mishandling of classified documents. And that involves his having taken a bunch of classified documents from the White House to his home in Mar-a-Lago when he left office the first time, and then declining to return them when asked. I mean, the latest legal wrangling is that a federal appeals court said that they indeed can be released. It is part of the special counsel regulations and rules that you write a report afterward, regardless of the outcome, and you release it. And Trump was trying to avoid this. What's different in this case, of course, is that it was short-circuited in a very unusual way. That is to say, the defendant got elected president, and so Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, following the guideline that you don't prosecute sitting presidents, drop the cases. And so that's just a very unusual ending to these cases. And I think that's a little bit of what's at issue here. And this is going to continue to be fought. There does need to be a distinction, though, because in the In the case that involves the allegations of mishandling of classified documents, there are two other defendants who may or may not continue to be prosecuted. These are two folks who worked for Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago and are charged with allegedly helping him hide these documents. And they're arguing that releasing a report on their case when they still may face a court would be very much unfair to them. And so for that reason, the Justice Department has said that regardless, they're not going to release that report anytime soon. Another thing we should just mention is that in a matter of a week and a half, the Justice Department is going to be run by Donald Trump and people who are, faithful to him. And therefore, it's not clear at all that these reports are going to see the light of day, regardless of what the courts say.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say we're more likely to see the January 6th report than the classified documents report because of those ongoing cases that you mentioned, which is kind of another interesting little tidbit here because, we talked about where the hush money case ranked in Trump's legal jeopardy. The classified documents case was the case that I think even a lot of Trump allies saw as the most threatening for him. And so the idea that we wouldn't even ultimately get a report from the special counsel in that case, I think would really be kind of a signifier about where all of this process has landed. Maeve, is there anything that you're interested in out of these reports? Anything that you think is going to actually have an impact if we do get them?
Well, I think that we were also stunned that those very dramatic hearings into January 6th really didn't move the needle on public opinion or really shape the opinions of Trump too much. And so, I think that it's important that these reports are produced and exist for the purposes of history. But we'll have to see once Trump is back in office and is being held responsible for, other things that Americans might not be happy with, whether there could be sort of an effect, a broader effect or sort of dissatisfaction with him that creeps in again. But you'd know better than I do, Aaron, but aren't his popularity ratings higher at this point than they were in the past?
Yeah, I was actually looking at this yesterday, and if you look at the 538 averages, Trump is on the verge of having his favorable rating be higher than his unfavorable rating for the first time since he got into politics. So that was never the case in his first term, even during the 2024 campaign. So I think that's a pretty significant development. And you mentioned kind of, the efforts to hold him accountable moving forward. I think one of the most significant results of these criminal cases are that we saw the Supreme Court come in because of legal issues that were raised in them and deliver Trump and other presidents a significant degree of immunity moving forward. After the break, we're going to be talking about the political fallout from the raging wildfires in California this week and the looming confirmation hearings for Trump's controversial pick for Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth. We'll be right back. I want to move now to the other side of the country. We are continuing to see horrific destruction from raging wildfires in California and the Los Angeles area. Tens of thousands of people have evacuated from their homes in Los Angeles and the neighboring towns and cities. The conditions are dire. Maeve, you've been out there covering the fires. Can you first tell us what it's been like to be out there, what you're seeing on the ground? Can you kind of just set the scene for us for, people who aren't on the ground there?
Yeah, so I live on the east side of the city, and the fires just erupted so quickly that, I think everyone was completely caught off guard, and they were so destructive so fast. There were wind gusts of, more than 60 miles an hour, up to 85 miles per hour in some parts of above Altadena, where a lot of the destruction took place. And of course, the Pacific Palisades is in ashes. One of my best friends watched the fire come over her fence from a ring cam after they had evacuated, and it now is just reduced to ash. They've lost everything. There are so many stories like that as I've been out on the fire line talking to people. And, A lot of the big issues here have been that the firefighting aircraft that would have done water drops, et cetera, couldn't fly at some of the most critical times because the winds were so high and the conditions were so bad. And then you have this issue of fire hydrants running dry. And I was covering the scene in Altadena as it was still burning earlier this week. And, you would just see one house ignite from embers coming down from the mountain and other houses on fire. And one house was just erupting after another, just popping up into flames. And there were firefighters on the street and trucks, but there was really nothing that they could do. And it's just heartbreaking to watch this destruction. So there's just a real mental toll, not just for the people who have been so horrifically affected, but for everyone else. I mean, the alerts are going off on your phone all the time. Yesterday, there was a false alert that we got where I am for us to evacuate immediately. There's just a feeling of absolute mental fatigue and this feeling that you're surrounded by fire and there's just not really any way to control what happens next.
So even though the fires are still burning and it feels kind of difficult to talk about politics, we have seen this injected with politics in recent days. We've seen President-elect Donald Trump already starting to pin the catastrophe on Democrats. He's been on social media talking about Governor Gavin Newsom's water management decisions. A lot of criticism of other officials, Trump talking about the idea that FEMA has no money. FEMA actually replenished its money in December. President Biden signed a bill that was putting money back in FEMA's funds right now. Experts that the Washington Post talked to say that water management decisions don't necessarily have the kind of effect that Trump has been talking about in California. I just wonder, Maeve, are people talking about accountability on the ground right now? And what are you hearing on that front?
They are. There is also, fury here about the situation that we're in. And even though a lot of people understand that there was really no way to fight that fire in the Palisades when the winds were moving that fast, and you couldn't get airdropping helicopters up high, the fact that there were fire hydrants that weren't working is really problematic, and people want answers about that. And so we have seen Governor Newsom, really defending himself and putting out lots of press releases about how another 900 firefighters are coming in. And both he and Mayor Karen Bass are talking about all of the resources that are coming in from other states and the fact that Biden has promised all this additional aircraft and resources and that the federal government will cover a lot of the cost of the recovery. But there's a lot of anger, and it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, both for Bass, who is up for re-election in 2026, and for Gavin Newsom, who is eyeing a White House run in 2028. Bass, in particular, has faced a barrage of criticism because she was actually in Ghana when these fires started, and people have pointed out that there were weather warnings days in advance that this was going to be a very high wind event. And so her decision to leave is something that has been a real problem here.
Yeah, Maeve, you mentioned the focus on Karen Bass, the Los Angeles mayor. She's actually been getting some criticism, including from people on the left, over her handling of this. And one of the claims that I've seen talked about a lot is the idea that the budget for firefighting services in Los Angeles had actually been decreased recently. You've done some reporting on this, and it's a little bit murkier than that, but can you explain the situation with the firefighting budget in Los Angeles?
Yeah, so the fire department's overall budget is more than $800 million. But we do see in the budget documents that I was going through yesterday that there was a $17.6 million reduction for the fire department in the fiscal year 24, 25, that budget. But Karen Bass has been really pushing back against that narrative, saying that the reductions would not have affected the response to the Palisades and the Eaton fires in any way. She said basically that there was money that was to be allocated to be distributed later on. Those are her exact words, which was actually going to support salaries in other parts of the fire department. And she said that it was important to understand that when the cuts were proposed, that LA was in, quote, tough budgetary times. So I think a lot of us are trying to get to the bottom of that. As someone who covered LA City Hall for a long time, I can tell you that, they do weird budget tricks sometimes where they take money out of the budget initially, but they find another way to restore it later on. And so we're trying to sort through all of that.
So we're all sorting through the fact checks right now. I think it's worth noting that being a politician invites this kind of scrutiny, especially at such tragic and important times. But Naftali, I think it's safe to say that Trump isn't just politicizing these things, but also politicizing them with misinformation. And that's also become pretty normal for him over the years. We've seen, of course, recently him lodging a bunch of false claims about Hurricane Helene and FEMA's response to it. Just earlier this month, we saw him falsely linking the attack in New Orleans on Bourbon Street to the border, even though the suspect is an American from Texas. Are you as struck as I am by this? It seems to be different to launch into this kind of thing at a very sensitive time, which is certainly what Trump has done in California.
Well, I do think it's striking, and I think we do remember how after Hurricane Helene, there was a lot of allegation that turned out to be false, that the Democrats and FEMA were favoring Democratic areas and abandoning Republican areas. And I think it was pretty damaging, and it was pretty thoroughly debunked. But you're right that does seem to be Trump's instinct. It's probably important to say that politics has never really been absent from natural disasters. I mean, it's a classic thing that whether it's Chicago mayors who are absent during a snowstorm or Hurricane Katrina and the problems that George W. Bush had after that. Politics does tend to get entangled in natural disasters. That said, Trump has a way of seemingly shooting from the hip fairly quickly when these things are still unfolding, when there's no evidence necessarily of wrongdoing. And when other politicians, I think we can just say, would have spoken more generally about the need for compassion and pulling together as Americans. So yeah, it's one more way in which he's taken some of our political traditions and really bent them in accordance with his own style.
Just one example of that, Aaron, is that because, as we know, I mean, that's Trump's whole technique is just trafficking in conspiracy theories and whatever's popping up, in the right-wing MAGA sphere. He came up with a complete fiction on Truth Social the other day that Governor Newsom had refused to sign something called a quote, water restoration declaration, is what Trump called it. And, Newsom's folks said that no such document actually exists. And, that it was completely wrong. And a lot of experts also fact check those claims, particularly noting that Trump's allegation that there's not enough water here is false. All the experts have said that there's ample water supplies here. The reservoirs are full. They're well above historical averages. And so, the reason why a lot of the hydrants were running dry was not because the region ran out of water, but because pressure drops with high demand, making it harder to move water around. And so Trump sort of throws these things out there, and then everyone has to unravel them. But he achieves his goal of, ginning up anger against his political opponents. And Gavin Newsom is always one of his chief targets.
Yeah, certainly a tragic set of circumstances made worse with misinformation. Guys, I wanted to turn just real quickly before we go to something that's happening next week, and that's that we're starting to see confirmation hearings for some of Donald Trump's cabinet picks. Trump, of course, isn't taking office until January 20th, but we are seeing the Senate, which has been sworn in, get to work on some of his picks. One of the big ones that I think we're watching out for is Trump's pick for defense secretary, Pete Hegseth. His confirmation hearings, I believe, are supposed to start on Tuesday. We could see some other picks see their hearings start, including Attorney General pick Pam Bondi, Director of National Intelligence pick Tulsi Gabbard. There's still some negotiating about those things. Naftali, what are you looking for next week? And are we going to be focusing on the Hegseth nomination, or are other ones going to creep in as well?
I think the Hegseth nomination is clearly going to be the focus of attention. He's the most imperiled nominee whose hearing is coming up in the near future. And I think it's fair to say that this is the first hearing in a long time that may really matter. These things are so choreographed now that even though ahead of time Democrats and Republicans say they're keeping an open mind and they want to hear the testimony, afterwards they all end up announcing that they're going to vote the way we all knew that they were to begin with. But in this case, I do think that there's some Republicans in particular that want to see how he acquits himself. I think in a way, the nomination or the confirmation is his to lose. Several sort of Republicans that might have been thought to have been skeptical have been speaking more supportive recently. And if he delivers a fairly impressive, calm, sympathetic, performance, then I think he's probably okay. He has an advantage in that he is by profession a TV host. So he's very good at public performances. That said, this is a different kind of environment. And it's one thing to be in front of the Senate where you have to be deferential and sympathetic and perhaps admit that you haven't always been perfect. That may be different from the demeanor of a Fox News host who is sort of unleashed and often ideological and often more aggressive. So I think watching how that plays out is going to be pretty much the key drama in the confirmation hearings next week.
Yeah, and Hegseth, of course, has been accused of sexual assault in the past. There are other skeletons in his closet, including affairs. He was accused of financial mismanagement of a veterans group in the past. So even some Republicans have been pushing for, information from the FBI about the various allegations against him.
And, Democrats are going to make this a real show, right? The only power that they have here is interrogation. And so while Trump's team can argue that they've got, votes locked down or they're going to be able to get X person through, a lot can be revealed in these hearings, as we saw with Brett Kavanaugh when he was up for the Supreme Court. And, in that case, obviously, he was ultimately confirmed. But you can get to a point where the information that is emerging becomes so uncomfortable for the public that public opinion, the tide starts to change. And that really can, shape the way that things go. I think that this could end up being more of a drama than we're expecting right now.
And it's also true that in this day and age, so much depends on viral moments. And so if there's a moment in which Hegseth appears really at a loss, whether it's about some of the allegations, for example, there have been allegations about excessive drinking, or whether it's about a complex weapon system that's soon to be deployed in some, little discussed part of Asia, and he just seems completely befuddled. I mean, those moments in this day and age when they can be spread rapidly on all kinds of social media could have a pretty big impact.
I think the Hegseth confirmation hearings are going to set the tone in a lot of ways, but I'm really looking forward to the Tulsi Gabbard and Kash Patel hearings. I think those are going to be really interesting. Gabbard, of course, is going to test even some Republicans' ability to support her, given some of her past positions. She's a former Democratic congresswoman. So some very interesting things happening with these nominations. But we're going to have to leave it there for today. Maeve Reston is a national political reporter for The Post. Thanks, Maeve.
Thank you so much.
And Naftali Ben-David is a White House editor and incoming senior national political correspondent for The Post. Thanks, Naftali.
Thank you for having me.
If you're tuning in via Post Reports, we will keep bringing you these conversations until Inauguration Day, usually on Fridays. And you can also listen via the Campaign Moment show feed itself. Today's episode was produced by Sabby Robinson and mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy. It was edited by Lucy Perkins and Rachel Van Dongen. Our team also includes Maggie Penman, Rena Flores, Monica Campbell, Ted Muldoon, Alana Gordon, Ariel Plotnick, Bishop Sand, Emma Talkoff, Sean Carter, Peter Bresnan, Laura Benshoff, Allison Michaels, Renita Jablonski, Martine Powers, and Alaha Izadi. I'm Aaron Blake. See you next time.